Hey guys, it's yours truly coming back at you all with another one, and today I'll be doing a video on hand traps. More specifically, the most relative set of hand traps to help you disrupt, prevent and restrict those meta style plays, one card combos and those combo decks that extend so well. Set up those awe-inspiring boards and just really make it difficult for you to effectively play Yu-Gi-Oh! And without further ado, let's get right into it. First we have Lancia, Ash, Battle Fader, DD Crow, Dimension Shifter, Troll, Vela, Fantasmic, Ghost Bell, Ghostoga, Ghost Reefer, Ghost Sister, Iron Dragon, Nibiru, Delta, Gamma, Rainbow Kuribo, Skullmeister, Scarecrow, Evenly Matched, Infinite Impermanence, and Red Reboot. And to go further in depth with what makes each one of these hand traps so effective against the meta style of play, those one card combos and those combo decks that extend really well, and set up those awe-inspiring boards like Infinite Negate and Buster Lock. Let's get right down into it. First off, we have Lancia. Its effect restricts cards from being banished, which is excellent against zombie type decks, Infernoids, Orcus, or cards and or effects that activate in the graveyard by banishing themselves to gain an additional action. Lancia's effect prevents cards from being banished, preventing those actions from being utilized. It's excellent against those decks that focus on banishing a lot of their cards to gain power-up effects like Grin and Zero Boros to power up those monsters. Artifact Lancia's effect, which prevents cards from being banished, is excellent at countering those types of decks. Ash Blossom, because it's one of the most generic hand traps, as 80 to 85% of decks now either add a card from the deck to the hand, special summons from the deck, or sends a card from the deck to the graveyard. Ash Blossom being able to interact or disrupt any of those types of actions is good. Battle Fader, this is really good at ending the battle phase so that you can avoid getting OTK'd. If any of you guys watch the Valkyrie deck request, if any of my opponents had a Battle Fader or a Swift Scarecrow, they could have easily prevented themselves from getting OTK, well, basically getting killed. DD Crow, its effect is really good, especially at banishing cards when they would be sent to the graveyard for the cost of another card's effect. Sometimes when your opponent's using cards as cost, it may also trigger their effect when being sent to the graveyard, such as using the effect of Atlantean Prince to send Dragoons to add Dragoons. When Atlantean Prince would send Dragoons to the graveyard, you can chain DD Crow in response to Prince's effect so that you can banish the Dragoons in the graveyard. When Prince's effect resolves, because Dragoon was banished before Prince's effect resolved, the Dragoons that were in the graveyard or sent to the graveyard that was banished by DD Crow's effect does not activate. DD Crow's effect is also really good when your opponent targets a card in the graveyard or uses an effect of a card in the graveyard that targets a card. You can banish that targeted card so that your opponent loses their target. Dimension Shifter, this card is also really good because if you have no cards in your graveyard, then any card that's sent to the graveyard is banished instead. So if your opponent is using a combo based deck that uses their graveyard like Synchrons, you can send this card to the graveyard immediately, say that you are going second, so that your opponent cannot utilize their graveyard to further extend any of their combo plays. Troll and Logbird, because the consistency of most decks have gone straight through the roof, them being able to add and draw cards, especially decks like Danger Dark World that has heavy draw power, or an Exodia Mega Draw deck. You want to make sure that you restrict your opponent from either drawing or adding cards so that they cannot further extend or set up any kind of board that's going to be really difficult for you to play Yu-Gi-Oh! Effect Veiler, because the meta is really dominated by spell and monster effects, and having Effect Veiler handy to be able to negate that troublesome monster effect that can cause your opponent gain an advantage or set up a board that's going to be troublesome to get over. To negate that monster effect, I guarantee you, is priceless. Fantasmic, because it's excellent against links, it's going to give you a +1 and allow you to recycle a card from your hand back in your deck that you may want in your deck, as well as put a monster body on board in the form of itself, as well as it also has a protection effect built in. Ghost Bell, because 80 to 85% of the decks now, they are now either adding cards from the graveyard back to their hand deck and or extra deck, special summoning monsters from the graveyard, as well as banishing cards from the graveyard. And Ghost Bell is an excellent way to disrupt those kinds of plays or actions. As well as an interesting side note, Ghost Bell can also be used to counter Call by the Grave, as Call by the Grave's effect banishes cards from the graveyard, well, monsters specifically from the graveyard, and you can use Ghost Bell to actually disrupt that interaction. Ghostoga, this card's effect is excellent against face-up spell and trap card effects that go off, mainly continuous spell and trap cards, as when you activate it in response, it would pop the face-up spell or trap card, and because it is not face up during resolution, they no longer gain that or their effect. And against a monster, the monster's effect would still resolve, but due to the fact that we have the link mechanic, removing that monster body from on board reduces your opponent's options to be able to link into something that could potentially be threatening. Ghost Reefer, this is a more strategic hand trap. You would really use this in a deck that doesn't require an extra deck, and what you would do is you would stack that extra deck with some of the more troublesome extra deck monsters that you may feel that you have a higher probability of encountering, like Utopic Zexal, Ultimate Falcon, Union Carrier, Hacker Fibrax, things of that nature. And what you would do is just use Reaper to banish them from the opponent's extra deck before they can even be summoned, because the golden rule is prevention is better than the cure. So if you can prevent combo routes from being taken by holding the Hacker Fibrax and just killing a lot of your opponent's one card combo plays, or getting rid of that Utopic Zexal so that your opponent doesn't stun you during your turn, or potentially an Ultimate Falcon, being able to prevent those things from coming to the board or ever being established can win you a decent amount of games and keep you relevant playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Ghost Sister, this is really a strategic style of play where you would actually, and when I mean strategic, more on the counter side, you really want to use this card with Solemns. You really want to, when your opponent goes off to extend, when they do extend, you gain life points based off of the monster's attack, and due to that fact, it would enable you to use a decent amount of your Solemns. So when your opponent would extend, you would allow them to extend, and you would only Solemn the interactions or the effects or the summon of a monster that would threaten your hand and or field advantage against your opponent. Iron Dragon, this is excellent, especially against Mech Knights and other Link decks, where you would have a Link monster inside the Link monster zone, a monster in the main monster zone, and a spell or trap card in the spell or trap card zone, all in the same column. Iron Dragon can special summon itself to the field and pop all three of those cards. And for an interesting side note, you can also utilize spell and trap cards of your own in the same column as the Iron Dragon, so that you can pop them and gain positive effects, so that you can gain the advantage of popping your own spell and trap cards to gain the advantage over your opponent. Nibiru, this has become a staple as well, along with Ash Blossom. A lot of decks, combo based decks, at least 80% of the decks now, they summon at least 5 or more times, and being able to disrupt the number of summons after they would have established a board to attempt to OTK you can save you. Double Nibiru, triple Nibiru, I highly recommend, as a lot of decks, they want to go first so that they can establish those boards, and being able to open up with at least one of those Nibirus, time its effect, and just tribute off all of those troublesome monster bodies that your opponent can potentially get on board, and then set up to OTK your opponent the following turn, can win you games very easily. As well as versus link monsters, because link monsters have no defense, when you do tribute them off, the defense of the token would be 0, making it very easy to run over. Cyframe Gear Delta, like I said, the meta is really controlled or dictated by spells and monster effects. Delta can negate the effect of spell cards, and Gamma negates the effect of monster effects, and because they activate in the hand and they don't go to the graveyard before the resolution of their effects, they are unaffected by Call by the Grave. The same thing goes for Nibiru, because they stay in hand until their effects are resolving. They cannot be hit by Call by the Grave unless you have a copy of that card in the grave that can be hit by Call by the Grave. Rainbow Kuribo, this one isn't used as much, but it's still good, as when your opponent would declare an attack, you can equip it to that monster and that monster can no longer attack. It's really good. You can use it against Rampage Dragon, that can, or any monster that actually multi-attacks. It's really good. And if your opponent has a effect, whether it be monster, spell, or trap, that can actually pop it and send it to the graveyard, you can then immediately special summon it back to stop a direct attack, which can help save you from getting OTK'd and giving you another turn to potentially play Yu-Gi-Oh! Skullmeister, this card's effect is really good. When a card effect is activated in the graveyard, you can negate that effect. Well, in your opponent's graveyard, you can send it from your hand to the graveyard to negate that effect. So whether it be monster, spell, or trap, if an effect activates in the opponent's graveyard, you can use him to negate that effect. Most, at least 80 to 85%, and I am being modest with these percentages, have an effect that activates in the graveyard, and being able to neg that effect is important. Those effects can extend and end up giving your opponent such a sizable advantage, especially if your opponent's going first with a really decent deck that's really consistent. You want to make sure that you neg as many of those effects as possible. Swift Scarecrow, the same thing as Battle Fader, being able to end the battle phase, excellent against Valkyries. Evenly Matched, this card is game changing. Your opponent sets up an awe-inspiring board, and if they cannot negate trap effects, hitting them with the evenly leaves them with the choice of only being remained with one card, and everything else will be banished face down. Not all the time you will always be able to have the condition set for a Lightning Storm, and Twin Twisters, MST, Cosmic Cyclone, those cards are limited to an extent in which they can get rid of numerous cards in the back row. And like I said, you won't always have Lightning Storm's condition to be fulfilled, and this is where Evenly Matched pays its dues. Being able to allow, not even allow, causing your opponent to banish all but one of their cards face down, no effects go off. Sometimes you may have or go off on Twin Twisters, MST, or Cosmic Cyclone, and whenever the cards that you are actually destroying or banishing by the effect may have an effect that when it's actually destroyed or banished, it still has another effect to go off. But due to the effect of evenly being banished face down, no effect goes off, and it reduces your opponent's field to 1. Also, an interesting side note, is that if your opponent removes the evenly matched before it resolves, such as via the effect of MST, Twin Twister, Monster Effect, or anything of that nature before it resolves, because it's no longer in the field, during the resolvement of its effect, now that you control no cards, your opponent would then have to banish their entire field. Infinite Impermanence. This is a better effect veiler in the sense that it cannot get hit by Call by the Grave, as well as it can also provide you with an additional disruption or negation by utilizing it in the same column as one of your opponent's spell or trap cards when you negate a monster effect. And lastly, we have Red Reboot. This is excellent as it's a trap card that you never need to set, but the interesting side note or the downside of this card is it's going to cost you half your life points, so you have to be careful when you activate this. But the upside to this card is the fact that against a trap heavy base deck, it's going to negate the trap card activated. It's going to force your opponent to set an additional trap card, as well as your opponent cannot activate any more trap cards for the rest of that turn, meaning that that is your opening to OTK your opponent, or if you have a evenly matched, to cause your opponent be able to banish the rest of their trap cards to even up the odds. And yeah, that's about it. That is all the effective hand traps that you can utilize to stay effective playing Yu-Gi-Oh! Against the meta, against those one card combo plays, against those combo decks that extend so well. These are your hand trap base lineup that you can utilize, and the most generic set of hand traps I will highlight for you guys, that being Ash, Nibiru, Effect Veiler, and yeah, man. I haven't seen Ghostoga played as much, but mainly these 4 hand traps are the 4 most generic hand traps. Oh, and imperm. These 5 right here are the most generic hand traps, and you want to make sure that you utilize them. The main reason why you want to utilize them, especially Ash and Veiler, is because a lot of decks that add and draw, they tend, or most players tend to utilize Call by the Grave so that their actions go true. And what this does is it saves you from having to utilize Call by the Grave in your deck, freeing up 3 slots to add in additional cards to push your combo plays through if you do get hit by a hand trap such as Ash or Effect Veiler. Also, when your opponent actually Call by the Graves your Ash or your Effect Veiler, or let's say DD Crow, what that does is, if your opponent is using a very similar or generic lineup just as you are, that means until the end of the following player's turn, which means if you Ash during your opponent's turn, until the end of your next turn, all Ash Blossoms, whether it be yours or your opponent's, that effect is going to remain negated. Meaning if your opponent has Ash, Effect Veiler, and a DD Crow in their lineup, and you have an Ash, Effect Veiler, and DD Crow in your lineup, and they Call by the Grave either of them, then until the end of your turn, your opponent also turned off their hand trap in that form, and that means you have 1 less negate or disruption to worry about. And yeah, that's all I have for you guys in terms of hand traps. Utilize them effectively, and you will find yourself effectively and relatively being a threat in Yu-Gi-Oh! So yeah, until next time guys, later.